Well, hello and welcome to this joint webcast by Asia Society Switzerland and the Adecco Group. My name is Nico Luchsinger and I'm the Executive Director of Asia Society Switzerland based in Zurich. So white-collar employees in Asia, and especially in Japan, have for years been known as salary men, people who spend their entire career at one company and don't ever go home before their boss does. But this archetypical worker may become a thing of the past. In various Asian countries, a rethink of the approach to work is underway. Companies and governments are cautiously testing the idea of a 4-day work week, as notoriously long working hours take a toll on staff with little to show in terms of productivity. Employees have fundamentally changed expectations of what they want to get out of their jobs, demanding a better work-life balance. And the pandemic really seems to have put this process on steroids. Singapore newspaper The Straits Times has recently branded what's happening now in the relation between companies and employers the great renegotiation. So what do white-collar workers in Asia want to get out of this renegotiation? Are companies, some of which are as big and complicated as nation states, able to adapt quickly enough? What role do governments play in this environment of changing work ethics? And is this really the end of the classic salary man? I'm happy today to discuss all of this with our two esteemed guests, Ian Lee, who is the Regional President Asia Pacific at the Adecco Group, the co-host of today's webcast. Ian is from Singapore and also normally based in Singapore, but today joins us from Italy. Hi, Ian, and welcome.
Hello.
And we're also joined by Dr. Nilanjan Raghunath, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, and the author of Shaping the Future of Work, The Power of Collaboration in Times of Disruption. And as it just so happens, Nilanjan, who's also normally based in Singapore today, is joining us from London. So this is almost a European webcast. Thank you both for being here. And I'm glad we could host this at a time when this would be convenient time zone-wise for you as well. Before we start the conversation with Ian and Nilanjan, I do want to say that we welcome any questions from our audience, which as always, you can please submit using the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to reserve the last 15 to 20 minutes of this 1-hour conversation to audience questions at least. So I suggest we start with this idea, this image, this stereotype, this archetype of the salary man as it's sort of been exemplified in movies and books, and just I think sort of a general notion and idea of Asia and especially of Japan. This image of the office worker first caught in a crushing morning commute and then in a fluorescent lit cubicle in a steel skyscraper, only to never go home before the boss does late at night, spending most of his or her time at the same company. Nilanjan, this is obviously a stereotype, but there is some truth to it. So maybe you can enlighten us and tell us a little bit when this salary man idea came to pass and why it's sort of developed so strongly in Japan.
Thank you so much, Nico. So the idea of the salary man is obviously, it's not a myth. There is a lot of truth to it. And of course, you know, the country that comes to mind is Japan. Let's go back in time to sort of the post-World War II era, where, you know, Japan started to fervently industrialize. And, you know, new companies were in the forefront to provide employment in post-war Japan. And creating jobs that actually lasted a lifetime was, of course, very, very important. And culturally, it sort of became the norm to embrace high technology and at the same time, create jobs that were long-term, lasted a lifetime. It became very entwined with the Japanese culture of security, of stability, and that's what people did. That's what people wanted, was security. Of course, the ideas of the salary man now have been seriously challenged because of newer innovation models in companies. But I think that the idea still exists somewhat in Japan, perhaps, you know, in different avatars now that are coming up of the salary man. But I think it really shows what business models have been like for the longest period in terms of trying to provide people with safe, secure, long-term employment. You joined there just after graduation, and of course, you never left until you retired, and maybe your company gave you a gold watch or something similar like that. But obviously, that has its ups and downs. One of the ups is, of course, lifetime secure employment. You always knew like which office to go to, and it was very hierarchical. So your boss most likely would have been older than you, more experienced than you, and so on. And the downside of it, of course, is it stifles innovation, as many companies are now finding out and then changing business models. So yes, definitely, the idea is a very Japanese one, but I'm sure the same model was replicated in many other countries across Asia because of the fact that Japanese companies in the 70s and 80s became very global.
Thank you. And maybe we can just follow up on this very last point, Nilanjan, with Ian. Obviously, Ian, you cover the entire Asia-Pacific region for Adecco, so you're well placed to answer this question. Nilanjan has told us a bit about where this idea comes from, and of course, we strongly associate it with Japan. Are there other Asian countries that also have seen a strong salaryman culture? And is the change that Nilanjan has described also on the way in these countries?
It's actually a very, very interesting concept of this, what I call the salaryman. I think Nilanjan has done a fairly good job just now in terms of explaining what is a salaryman. And honestly, if I think about the rest of Asia, I think this is probably tied to, I would say, two things. One, the relative development of the economy. And if you think about after World War II, Japan is probably the very, very first that started with the industrial revolutions, with economy picking up and all those things, and then it just sort of like passed through. From Japan, if you think about Singapore, think about my dad's time, my mom's time, I think a lot of people are looking for jobs, and when they have the jobs, they want stabilities. They want, stabilities in terms of their income. They want stabilities in terms of, going to work, and all those things. So it is not just a Japanese concept. However, if you think going down south into Australia, into New Zealand, I think those economies also started, especially Australia. I think they were more of a developed nations. So that I see less in that part of the world. I'm seeing honestly, the India has gone through that phase. And now it's moving into a different phase. So I think this is probably tied to number one, the economic development, stages of economic development. I think there's also another second part, which probably related to culture, to conformity in the culture. I think Nilanjan, you are probably an expert in these areas. And if you look between Japan, Singapore, in terms of, the culture tightness, conformity, if you are not conform, you get punished. And I believe that Japan is probably more towards that. And there are actually in a lot of nation, if you go down south, like Singapore and all those things are fairly tight, in terms of compliance. So that's how I see it. However, I'm also seeing a lot of changes.
Thank you. And we're going to want to dig in a bit on these changes and also on sort of the question on how Asia-specific these changes and the reasons for them are. I do want to bring in some numbers here that I found quite staggering from different recent research. It's been shown that in Hong Kong, only 28% of employees said that they were happy at work. In Singapore, only 27% of the workforce say they're happy. And in South Korea, only 21% of employees go happily to work while spending an average of 1,908 hours working in 2020, which was 221 hours more than the OECD average. Nilanjan, can you put these numbers in context for us? Why does it seem that these Asian workforces are quite severely unhappy? Where does that come from?
I want to pick up on what Ian said about the conformity culture. And I think the conformity culture prevails very strongly, I would say, in Asian societies, also sometimes with Asian managers. The idea that the work culture is highly hierarchical. Typically, you just do your job, you barely ask questions. And what's happening is that the expectations of this so-called like the stereotypical salary man has changed over time as we have new generations coming into the workforce, like millennials and now, of course, Gen Z, etc., where people want a voice in the workplace. They want fulfillment. They want more out of work than just a paycheck, at the end. So in that sense, they feel sometimes that they're not heard. They can't feed back openly. They find it very stifling. There are other reasons as well. Sometimes they feel, they asked for a promotion and didn't get one. They asked for a pay raise, they didn't get one. But I think a lot of it is really to do about not, being seen, but, not being heard. I think which is a problem that at least the people that I've interviewed have told me that they're not getting that fulfillment. And the other thing is, of course, people sometimes feel that they've taken on a job that they're not really the right fit for, because the expectations are very different from, say, the job advertisement that was posted, or that, there's a misfit between sort of expectations and actual reality. So I think culture is a huge component of this, cultural and business model mismatch, employees sort of not fully understanding each other. And of course, changing times. And one example I want to point out is, see, the old variation of the salaryman, of course, went home after his boss went home, probably worked with paper and pen. But now think about it. Technology is supposed to have made our lives easier, but now we're contactable 24/7. You can get an email, at 5 a.m. from your boss, and most likely than not, you will reply, or you might be contacted on the weekend, or you may be asked to do many things. So I think now it is, in so many ways, it's liberating, but in so many other ways, our work lives have become quite intense. And as a result, you find that some people who haven't found their own sort of sweet spot in terms of their ideal job and their ideal career oftentimes feel they're unhappy. So, I'm not surprised to see those numbers.
Thank you. We've talked quite a bit now sort of about the employee side of this and the reasons why these employees may feel so unhappy. But Ian, there's of course also the employer side. And I would think that with so many employees on average so unhappy, that would obviously affect the employer as well and the company as well. So historically, how high has awareness among employers been for numbers like this? And is that something that you see changing? Do employers in the region care that their employees are also unhappy?
Yeah, Nico, put it this way. I believe that Asia is not, Asia are still relatively new to the world of management. If you think about East and West, okay? So, and if you think that where Asian stands, usually it is still at the if you think of Asians in general, we are thinking about plant managers, country managers. You're not definitely the West. Okay, so you are still, even on the management level, you are still sort of like in the middle. So then there is also this conformity. I want to be more regimental. You follow certain models. We are also not honestly the best from a creativity standpoint. If you think from that aspects of creativity of management, and honestly also, Nico, work-life balance is still relatively new concept in Asia. So when you add all those things up, I think we still have a long way to go. Let's put it that way.
One thing I've wanted to ask about, because it seems to me related to this concept of the salaryman, is a somewhat similar concept that's been popular in China for the last few years before there's been a little bit of a crackdown of sorts from the government and that's usually referred to as 996. It's a concept that at least used to be very popular among Chinese tech firms, and it would refer to the fact that people were expected to work from their employers, but also from their peers, to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, so every day until except for Sunday. Ian, to which extent do you see this 996, and I find it interesting because it came out of tech firms, and it came out of very new, fast-growing, modern companies. This was not something invented by state-owned enterprises who would sort of maybe more conservative reputation. To which extent is this concept related to this concept of the salaryman that we've been discussing? And what do you make of the fact that it's been actively fought by the Chinese government as of last year?
Yeah, Nico, I think we are talking about a slightly different thing over here. Okay, the types of culture that the tech company was I use the word was because it was actually noticed by the government. In fact, I would say the salaryman concept probably apply more to the SOE because you're talking about a group that needs to be conformed. However, I would say the driver of the tech firm are driven by competitions, are driven by they need to get multiple times of growth in order to be able to sustain their stock prices and all those things. So it's competitive. It's competitive nature. In fact, that sector in China is very, very competitive, and they were able to get the creme de la creme from the universities in China. So everyone wants to go to Tencent, everyone wants to go to Alibaba, everyone wants to go to tech. So it's competition between business, it's competition within people. I believe that's probably more driver than because the company wants people to work from 9 to 6. So, and you can see that is also part of the I would say attention that the government is given to the tech, because they have gotten to be so big, and then they start questioning whether this types of culture is the right one. I mean, really, they are getting to be very, very big, those tech firms, and they are into your everyday lives. That's how I see it, Nico.
Thank you. We've already spoken a little bit, and I want to go further on this, on sort of the underlying macro trends that fuel all the changes that we've been discussing. You mentioned, of course, economic development, which is kind of very basic, affected as economies develop, and also as companies change, as jobs change, that also, of course, has an effect on work culture. But you also said that there's a specific cultural aspect to this that maybe is more specific to Asia, or at least to East Asia, where there's maybe more of a conformity in culture. And Nilanjan, I do want to ask about other factors. One that comes to mind would be demographic shifts, which again, it's not particular to Asia, but at least in some Asian countries, that shift is most pronounced. When we think of Japan, but also increasingly China, think of South Korea, those are all countries which struggle with large demographic trends, which of course then has an impact just on the availability of employees and of talent. To which extent does this shift and sort of the increased scarcity of the workforce play into what we're seeing here?
Well, I think there are two major shifts happening. One is, of course, in some of these countries, there is an aging population. Some of the other countries in Asia, like say, for example, India, has a younger population. But say for Japan, Singapore, etc., it's an aging population. So there are these different trends. But at the same time, if you look at the current workforce, it is millennials who are largely represented, in the current workforce, probably in the biggest numbers. If one did a survey, that's what, and there are a lot of surveys out there, from Deloitte to everyone, does these surveys like every single year. And you can see that essentially the work culture has changed towards, I would argue that almost every company is now trying to become like a tech company, even though they're not doing tech. It's a question of trying to bring in more of that level of productivity, innovation, creativity. And also, it's a struggle, I think, for some companies that are very traditional. It's a struggle, but they realize that a culture that's more open, for example, brings in more innovation, etc. So I feel there is this sort of a struggle for some companies to actually embrace this in a big way, the openness, the flat hierarchies of tech companies. At the same time, I think there's definitely like a drive towards that, because that's what younger people, they want to work for that. So when you go to recruitment events in a lot of these companies, you find that younger people are very attracted to companies, that promise this kind of open culture. Simple things like, I can work from anywhere. I don't have a dedicated office space, or I can actually work from home on certain days, or I can wear jeans on Friday. These things matter a lot. So you find that certain companies are, of course, drawing a lot of the talent in, and other companies, then they struggle because, they can't find enough people to come and do that. And that is also like, I just want to bring in another very important factor here, and that's automation, because how automation has really shifted the kinds of skills that people need, because, these skills are constantly changing. So there is competition for talent, and then of course the right kind of talent, and then worrying about how do we retrain this talent, keep them up to mark. And also people changing jobs continuously. And then what do countries do? They start to rely on migrants to fill some of these jobs, because they can't, they may not have enough people of their own, unless, of course, it's like a very big country like India or China, which is a whole other story. But like, for example, in Singapore, right, we always have a talent crunch. We need people to fill in many sectors. And then of course, it is also then about keeping your population happy, justifying to them why you need all these migrants to fill in these jobs. And that's no easy job for any government to do.
Thank you very much, Nilanjan. And again, as before, I also want to switch perspective from to look at this from an employer's perspective. Ian, you manage a fairly large business across the region, and I'm sure among the people that you manage, there are plenty of millennials and Gen Zers. So largely, in your experience and average, are they more difficult to manage? What is different in terms of employing these generations versus maybe previous generations? What are sort of the key experiences that you've made?
Yeah, I would not say they are more difficult to manage, because if I say they are more difficult to manage, I think nobody is going to come and work for Adecco. So I would basically say they are different. They think differently. I think just now Nilan hit the nail on the head. In fact, they expect to wear jeans to work every day. We have to tell them what is professionalism. We have to teach them all those things. However, I think the work culture overall is also changing in this part of the world. And Nicole, you are right that COVID actually accelerated a lot of things. I'm going to give an example of Japan, which honestly is an epitome of what I see changes. Okay, I have never imagined that one day I see in Japan that people are truly working from home. I've been working for 30 plus years, and I can tell you this is the first time. I never expect in my generation to see this, that the Japanese did not care whether they are with the boss or not. They did not care actually. At one point of time, a hypothesis is that the Japanese man have to come to the office or work, even if he did not have a job, he will have to leave home. Else the wife will find him to be useless. Again, in Japan, what we see is that 70% of my workforce, my full-time employee actually works from home. 70%, so it means only 30% of the people works in the office. So it's a completely different change in mindset in a very short period of time. Mm-hmm. So again, I see millennials or even people are changing their work habits in terms of their demands and all those things. And the very telling one starts from Japan. And if Japanese can change, I think it's even bigger from the rest of Asia.
And Ian, let me follow up here, because I think you said an interesting thing there. So you said part of this is also, there was this gender stereotype previously in Japan, where the man was expected to leave the house every day to go to work, even if there was no work to go to, and you see that shifted. To which extent does gender play a role in this? So is this also because female labor participation has actually increased in Japan in recent years? So it's sort of the more, probably we don't want to yet say it's sort of balanced, but of the increased percentage of women going to work in Japan and other Asian countries contributing to this trend as well?
Yeah. Nico, it's a very interesting research topic. I did not have empirical evidence because is it driven by the change in demographics between men and women? Okay, said that can be one of the reasons, but I think it's more of a mindset, more of a mindset change that office is a different concept versus the past. Work is a different concept versus the past. I think that's probably a bigger driver versus, because of the change in demographics. But Nico, I can tell you, I think there's also something that pertaining to our Asian cultures versus the Western cultures. If you think about this, our young people, in the West, let's say in the US or UK, they go to universities. After universities, they are considered as independent. They will not stay with their parents. Okay. However, in the Asian cultures, especially in East or in let's say in Southeast Asia, your independence will come probably much later than the West. So those are things that your parents are still watching you, even you're 35 years old, which is unheard of in the Western world. Okay, so those are the things that I think there is a difference in terms of the behaviors and all those things. Coming to office might be a release or an escape away from home.
Ian, I'm very, very glad you brought up the parents, because I was going to ask Nilanjan about this. Anyways, Nilanjan, you commented on this a while ago in a different setting, and I found this interesting, right? That there's, the way I interpreted this is there's almost a tension between the demand of millennials and Gen Zers for more flexibility, for more adaptability, but also, and we can talk about more about this later, about this idea that, sort of there's more to work than just, climbing the ladder and earning a salary. It has to be filled with meaning. So this is on one side, but then there's tension between this and the perhaps more traditional views that these people's parents may hold, where, there's still sort of the pinnacle of work is having this straight line career in one company. From the research you do and the interviews that you've conducted with employees, Nilanjan, how does this tension play out? How do people navigate the tensions, not just with their employers, but also with their parents as they try to sort of change the way they work?
I think certainly this tension does exist, because when I interviewed millennials, and I interviewed millennials of different ages, people just entering their first job versus people already in their job, like say for 5 years, etc. And you can always see that the parent-family component is always there. And this is interesting because, like Ian said, like it's not there. I would say it's that in the West, I mean, sorry to stereotype the East and West like this, but when I interviewed people in the US, in one prestigious school in the US, that never came up. It was never about what does my family think about what I'm doing. It's what do I want, right? Whereas in the Asian context that I was looking at, it was that before, I would say it was like, what do my parents want? Now the tension is, what do my parents want and how can I make them agree to what I want? And so is this thing like, I would say like this grand negotiation between what my parents have told me, what they've socialized me. And it's not just parents, it's also the broader society, the culture. Like there is some expectation that, that you will do certain things, like you will earn money. You would have like benefited, say, from the meritocratic system, and you're going to give back something to society. So that's very strong as well. It's like, I can't afford to be a loser, I have to do something that society approves of. Now, sometimes this translates into like, oh, I have to get a job in an MNC or a bank or whatever. But I could see like a slight shift in those dreams. Like, it's still an outlier kind of thing, but people telling me, well, I want to be a professional YouTuber. I mean, think about that, right? To a lot of parents, that's like, oh my God, they probably have a heart attack saying, I want to be a professional musician or a YouTuber or an artist. But that's kind of slowly creeping in, not at the cost of saying, okay, I will not work in a regular job, but I will do the regular job and add this. So there's like some kind of a balancing act going on between, I'll try and please myself and my family, but there's definitely a shift there, because at least people are saying that, I want to try and please myself as well, my career ambitions, versus saying, it's only going to be that of my parents. So there is a shift there. And some actually told me something interesting. For the first 5 years, I'll do what my parents want, then I will shift. So I will move on to something after I convince them. Yeah. The other interesting point here is, of course, not just choosing careers that are different, because technology makes alternate careers, even possible, which we couldn't think of before. But secondly, it's also about entrepreneurship. Like, how young, can you be to actually run a startup? Now the age is going down, right? Before it was people like, oh, let me get a few years experience, contacts, work in a good company, then I will become an entrepreneur. Now it's like they're barely done with college and they're like, I want to do a startup. So that again is taking a shift, because their parents are not too happy about them taking a risk at such a young age, where they don't have job security. But I can see this in Asian families, this kind of negotiation now going on, which is a very interesting phenomenon.
Ian, I want to ask about sort of some of the very prominent aspects of how culture is changing. And I think that's the one that's usually being mentioned, that came up a couple of times in the conversation as well, of course, is working from home. And as you've mentioned, the pandemic, of course, has played a big role in popularizing this idea and showing companies sometimes and employees against their will sometimes that this can actually work. My sense, just from observations here in Europe, is that the picture is sort of ambiguous. Well, in a lot of organizations, a lot of companies, work from home, at least partially, is here to stay. There have been plenty of examples also from companies demanding or strongly suggesting that their employees come back. Can you give us a high-level picture, if that's at all possible, on in the region Asia, and whether there are any regional differences? How widespread is working from home, and do you expect it to to become even more widespread, or to stay as widespread as it is right now? I know that you said it's common for you, it's common at Adecco. Of course, there are plenty of other companies, and the picture may not be quite as clear across the region.
Yeah. So, Nico, the way I'll put it is this: the days of working in the office for completely, is over. Okay, mm-hmm. It's that for sure is over. So in the past, you expect people to come to work 5 days, 6 days, in the office, to promote group activities, and all those things are done. And that's actually the only thing I would say is quite certain. The rest, I think there's not just cultural things. I think there is also, a big difference in terms of the space. If you think about Asia, when you are living in an apartment, let's say in Hong Kong, think about this. You are living an apartment in Hong Kong. If you have a 50 meters square house, it's not considered as small. It's reasonable size. But I would say, if you think about 50 meters squares for a family of 3 or 4 in Switzerland, just imagine. In Zurich, just imagine. So the space constraint is also different. And if both the husband and the wife are working from home, you just think about in a 50 meters square space. That is that in itself is a restriction, and I'm not talking about just Hong Kong. Space in Singapore, and all those things. These are countries that space is at a premium. Even even China. So working from home has a positive connotation, but working from home has also a negative connotation. Just now I talk about, what I'm certain is people want a little bit of flexibility, but if I'm telling people not to come to work for 5 days, I've also encountered issues. Mm. So people are human beings. Human beings are actually also group animal. Okay, they also are afraid that they get left out. So, I think it's somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think the argument that you're making, Ian, with space is very good, and I hadn't really considered that, but of course it makes a lot of sense that there's a limit to the attractiveness of working from home if home is just not such an attractive workplace, and that's strongly allocated with space. I'm wondering, I don't know if there's any data in this, but I'm wondering to which extent the distance of the commute would also factor into this, right? So it seems that compared maybe to at least some of the European cities, these big Asian cities that you've mentioned, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Tokyo, they suffer from comparatively less space, so people will be more constrained at home, which may make working at home less attractive. But then it stands to reason that they also have longer commutes, right? So that they would, if they have to go to the office, they will have to spend more time commuting versus, if you live in a relatively small European city. Do you have a gut feeling of sort of how these two trends interact? Because they seem to run against each other. One sort of making working from home less attractive, the other more. Is there one that's gonna eventually sort of come out on top?
I honestly, Nico, I do not think that. I think there are a few factors that are in play over here. Okay, distance is also one. Space at home is also another one. And also the other thing, which is quite Asian, is, when you finish school and you started working, you usually are also staying with your parents. And actually unheard of in the Western world. You know, if you're staying with your parents after a certain age, you are viewed as a failure, put it this way, in a lot of Western countries. So, you know, I think there's not just one factor. There are a couple of factors at play over here. Now, which one is, because I mean, there are people that have kids. And, you know, when you have young kids also, it's another factor. Okay, and just think about when there was lockdown, everybody was at home in a very small space. That can actually make people feel crazy. That's why there are a lot of mental issues we talk about. Why we need to care about mental. Those are the things that are in play. And honestly, I see lesser of that in the West versus the East. From a space, from the demographic context standpoint that I talk about. I'm not sure whether Nilanjan, you agree with me?
Really agree with you, because I think the fact is sometimes people want to get away from the house. You know, in some Asian societies, because it's too much. Like you said, you know, people are living with their parents. Sometimes it's too much. There's no privacy. They can't do what they want. So if you think about the commute, I think sometimes people don't mind that, as opposed to the fact that they want something different. They want to be outside, right? They don't. And in the pandemic, for example, people found it difficult in a small space to all be working together. You know, I think it drove some people crazy, like, you know, that they didn't have the privacy to sort of, you know, make a Zoom call or do something, because so many people were sharing that space, and, you know, they had just limited number of devices at home, you know, depending on which country they were living in. So I think we have to view this as a trade-off, right? It depends on what kind of resources you have available on your hand.
Thank you. I do want to ask one last question, and before we move on to audience questions. So if you do have a question to both of our panelists and haven't submitted it yet, you can do so under the Q&A box, and we'll get to those in a minute. Before we get there, though, Ian, one thing that I find interesting is that we've been kind of talking about this shift, and I think one aspect of the shift that we've been discussing is, of course, decreased loyalty from the employee towards the employer. People don't stay with a company for their lives. They may change jobs every once in a year. And I think broadly, you know, in this conversation, but also elsewhere, this is seen as a positive trend, right? It makes the marketplace more flexible. It allows for people to develop in different direction. It allows for companies, you know, to get the talent at the time that they need it. But there does seem to me one possible drawback of this, which is that at the same time that all of this is happening, it also becomes increasingly important to invest in continuous learning and to make sure that people, you know, don't just stop when they leave school in terms of getting educated and getting trained, but this is a much more continuous process. And it seems to me that as a company, if you can assume that, you know, most of your employees are going to be leaving after a certain number of years, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, and not stay with you for extended periods of time, wouldn't that also decrease your incentive to invest into learning? So that seems like a little bit of a tension there, where we, on one hand, should increase our investment into continuous learning, but maybe have less of an incentive to do so because of this this increased flexibility. Does that tension even exist? And if so, would you see ways to address it?
Nico, you raised a very, very interesting question. However, let me put things in perspective. You know, this is like an uphill battle. If you are climbing and you stop, you actually go down. Okay. Why did I say that? Right now, because of technology, you talk about AIs, you know, machine learnings and all those things. A lot of jobs are being replaced by machines, by technologies, and you know. However, there are new areas that are coming up. Like, for example, data is one. You know, think about the data that we have today, even versus yesterday. it's growing at a gazillions types of pace. And then, think about 10 years ago. So things are changing. Unfortunately, if a company did not change, it is going to die. That's how I see it. So from that simple reasons, there's also another factor at play right now. Right now, everybody is facing a talent crunch, one way or the other. So, you can continuously go out and get people, or you can also retrain your people to be doing a different jobs. Because the cost is getting higher and higher to go out and hire all the times. So I think, it will become a national exercise for everybody to be continuously improving. Because if you're not, you're dead. That's how I see it, Nico.
Thank you. Nilanjan, any additional comments?
Yes, I think retraining is now on, most countries' agenda, especially countries that are going, fast on the automation route, because they realize that, you don't have a population that can retrain, then you're in trouble, because companies are not going to find the workforce that they need, and they're going to fall behind, and definitely many companies will have to pack up. But I think as far as retraining is concerned as well, I think it's also an individual responsibility, because companies can't do everything. It's also an individual to sort of stay up to date and relevant. And I think this is what this is going to be the new route to sort of social mobility and economic success, is like, companies, working with government, to have the necessary retraining capacity, right, for various jobs, because jobs are changing so fast because of technology. And on the other hand, sort of individuals taking on that agency to sort of self-improve themselves so that they stay relevant.
Thank you. Let me bring in some of the questions from the audience. And the first one kind of asks about risks and drawbacks of this increased flexibility, not just in terms of changing jobs, but the general work arrangement, be that work from home or flexible work times or 4-hour work weeks. So Nilanjan, maybe asking you first, what are the risks and drawbacks that you see in sort of these changes? And is there a line that needs to be drawn, or do you see companies sort of drawing a line where they say, well, we're willing to give you this much flexibility, but no further? Is there such a thing as too much flexibility, I guess would be another way to put the question.
I think so. I mean, depending on what business model the company has. I mean, on the one hand, flexibility seems to be like, there's no turning back right now. But on the other hand, some companies are asking their employees to come back because they're paying such huge rents, for the real estate that they're hiring. It's not cheap to have offices, particularly in prime locations around the world. And some companies worry about the productivity, how do they measure productivity of people staying at home versus if you're physically in the job? I think it's the nature of what the company is actually doing. Like, are you services, manufacturing, tech, whatever. So there is this tension. I don't particularly believe that there's this perfect combination of how long the work week should be, or should it be hybrid or not. I guess it's a lot to do with what does the employer want, what does the employee want, and what's a good fit for them. So I guess every company will have to figure out their own, recipe for this.
Mm-hmm.
In line with national policy, of course.
Ian, are you aware of any, you don't have to give us names, are you aware of any companies that have, even maybe rolled back flexibility requirement? Nilanjan, of course, you mentioned that some companies are asking people to come back from home again. Are there other sort of examples of companies like going almost too far in their quest of becoming more attractive to millennial and Gen Z workers, and that's sort of having to roll that back because it just didn't work?
No, it's okay. I'm just going to tell you, within my remit of business, there are some countries that we were actually prescribing people to come to work for 2 days at the minimum, and we are actually moving it into 3 days. We talk about drawbacks. I can tell you drawbacks sometimes is the lack of personal touch, collaborations. Those are things that are very, very important for business to progress. And and sometimes you just can't just do it over Zoom or over Teams.
Yeah.
Okay. And unfortunately, the performance management systems, it all depends on the levels that you have. You are at a higher level, maybe, you can, it's a results driven types of, the more, the higher you go in the corporate hierarchy, it's about, how you deliver the outcome in terms of your profits, in terms of your sales and all those things. But when you go down the hierarchy, it's not that easily defined that this is attributed to you. So, there are, I'm seeing that not only us, when I was talking to friends, to people in the industries or outside the industries, we are saying that there's no prescribed rule in terms of whether you should have 1 day, you should have 2 days, or, you should prescribe one of the days is a team days and all those things. So that for sure, there are some that are actually moving back. But again, the only thing that I said just now that I can confirm is flexibility is here to stay. So that's all. But how many days that you need to come to work, and all those things, what really is work is also a different thing. Nicole, the last time I was in Europe was March 13 of 2020. Okay? And I can also tell you, from March 20 until now, last week was the first time I came back to Switzerland. Okay? And, there are first time that I see people that I've been working with for 2 years, for the past 1 year. And that there's some interesting remarks that I was making. Wow, you are so big. Wow, you are so small. So, I think people are human beings. Human beings still need human touch. So those are important. You can't just define a human being by the screen.
Thank you very much. I want to end the conversations with one topic that we sort of excluded until now, but I think it's important. That is on the role of governments. So as sort of work ethics are changing, as the marketplaces, the workplaces are changing, and Ian, maybe you can answer this first, and then we'll go to Nilanjan. What is the role of a government in sort of to ensure that these marketplaces work smoothly, to ensure that companies can be productive, that employees have their rights? Is there anything that needs to change from the government perspectives in response to these changes that we've been discussing for the past hour?
Nico, probably I start first, and I would love to hear what Nilanjan think about this. I felt that, the other thing that I am for sure is this gig economy, types of work is here to stay. Okay. Now, it is important for the government to recognize this, because, there are also consequences of this. Social security, social safety nets needs to be there to recognize this is a legitimate form of work that is also protected. I think that's fundamentals as I see it. Okay. Then I would basically say there is also another thing that government can facilitate that I felt the Singapore government has done pretty well. It's regarding just now when you talk about reskilling. The government can play a active role to make that sort of like a national activities. A lifelong learning is important for people. It's an investment in your future, because today, if you study finance as an accountant, I'm not sure whether the lifespan of accountant can be 30 years from now. So those are things that I felt that government need to recognize and can do better.
Thank you, Nilanjan.
Yes, I agree with that, because I think governments need to be more proactive. It can't just be like, tech companies, like say the big tech companies, they can't just be the ones running the world. That's something we need to think about. So in other words, I think governments really need to be up to date in terms of what's happening in terms of innovation, and make sure that the necessary infrastructure is in place, so that citizens, who want to upgrade can upgrade their skills. And companies, for example, that want to upgrade can also upgrade their technologies, because otherwise, I think what will happen is economies will fall behind. This is a very big challenge. So in other words, I mean, in Singapore, we have this very big endeavor called the Skills Future, which is really available widely to the population. It doesn't matter who you are, what your socioeconomic background is, you can access it, right? And so the thing is, it's easy to access. It's not like I have to search and fiddle around, to actually know what this is. It's so well organized and communicated to the wider population that everybody knows that they have a certain number of credits and they can use it, right? Of course, more research needs to be done as to see how to encourage more people to take on these things and what should they be doing, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, I guess no one can be forced to do these things. It's just that the opportunities, I think, need to be made available, especially because there are so many jobs that are right now at the high risk of elimination because of automation. So, retraining is one way to go. And the other thing is, of course, having conversations with the stakeholders. So who are the stakeholders? Of course, you can think about industry, citizens, right? So there are different stakeholders in any economy. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody follows the same model. Each country will have their own needs and definitions of these things, but I think it's so important to have transparent conversations with stakeholders and say, look, what do people actually need? And it's not just what do people want. That, of course, is important. But what does the population need to stay economically relevant? And of course, economic relevance goes hand in hand with social cohesion, right? You can't have one without the other. So, you want to keep your population cohesive, at the same time, provide the opportunities for them to actually have a better life, right? And I think that, so in that case, governments play a very important role in at least creating opportunities, according to whatever system they have in place in a particular country.
Thank you very much, Nilanjan. It's always quite difficult, to try to summarize wide-ranging conversations like this. But here at the end, if I think the key things I'm taking away from this very, very insightful conversation is that, as so very often, the trends we are observing in Asia broadly, are similar to the trends that we're observing elsewhere. But because of Asia's size, because of its diversity, they may just be a little bit more pronounced, and they may be somewhat harder to manage, both when you talk about sort of looking at countries with very different demographic trends, but also with this question. I like this term very much, Nilanjan, that used at the end of infrastructure to allow people, but also companies, to upgrade their skills as we go forward. I do think that's a highly interesting term. So thank you very much, Nilanjan Raghunath and Ian Lee, for taking time out of both your European trips. I acknowledge that that's something that doesn't happen all that often, hasn't happened so often in recent times. So thank you for taking the time while traveling to Europe to speak to us. This was incredibly insightful. Thank you again also to Adecco Group for co-hosting today's conversation with us. I think there's plenty of things to take away, and most importantly, plenty of open questions that we can address the next time we speak. So thank you again to Ian Lee in Italy and Nilanjan Raghunath in London. And thank you to everybody who's joined us today. See you next time.
Thank you, Nico. Thank